While 50 million people died, a handful of families became unimaginably wealthy. This is the story nobody tells you about the Black Death. You think you know the plague, death carts, empty villages, Europe on its knees, but what if I told you the Black Death was the greatest wealth transfer in human history? That some of the most powerful dynasties you've ever heard of, names that shaped the Renaissance, banking, and even modern Europe, owe their entire empires to a pandemic. The Medici, the Visconti, families that would rule cities, fund Michelangelo, and reshape civilization itself. They didn't just survive the plague, they got rich from it. Disturbingly, impossibly rich. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed half of Europe, 50 million people, gone, entire bloodlines erased overnight. But here's what they don't teach you in school. When that many people die, their wealth doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere. Their land doesn't vanish. Someone inherits it. Their businesses don't close. Someone takes them over. The Black Death wasn't just a health crisis. It was the most violent economic restructuring in European history. Think about it. Labor shortages destroyed feudalism overnight. Abandoned estates created a property free for all. Banking networks collapsed, leaving massive gaps. Noble families lost their heirs, ending centuries-old dynasties. Trade routes fell apart and had to be rebuilt from scratch. And through every crack in the old system, new winners emerged, not by accident, by strategy. The question isn't, did people profit from the plague? The question is, who were they, and how did they do it? Let's start with the most famous name in Renaissance history, the Medici family. You know them as patrons of the arts, rulers of Florence, the family that gave us multiple popes. But here's the origin story nobody mentions. They built their empire on plague economics. Meet Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici. In 1397, right after the second major plague wave, he founded the Medici Bank. Timing? Immaculate. Here's what happened. Florence's dominant banking families, the Bardi and Peruzzi, had been crushed. Entire branches wiped out by plague deaths, partners gone, heirs dead, financial networks in ruins. Giovanni walked into that vacuum and took everything. The Medici Bank became the papacy's official banker, a contract worth fortunes. Controlled trade routes across Europe. Dominated Florentine politics by default. Why? Because their competitors literally didn't exist anymore. Without the plague, the Medici would have been successful bankers. With the plague, they became one of the most powerful families in European history. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel, he was being paid with money that traced back to plague profits. The Renaissance itself was partially funded by pandemic economics. If the Medici were opportunistic, the Visconti family of Milan were ruthless. During the plague, noble families died without heirs constantly. 60% mortality rate means estates up for grabs. And the Visconti? They grabbed everything. Bernabo Visconti expanded Milan's territory by absorbing lands from families extinguished by disease. His successor, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, married strategically and seized aggressively until he had enough power to be crowned the first Duke of Milan in 1395. In a normal era, that kind of expansion would take generations of warfare. After the Black Death, 1 generation. The math was simple. When aristocracy collapses all around you, becoming heir to multiple estates isn't luck. It's probability. The Visconti weren't villains. They were just playing a game where half the players had been removed from the board. Cross the English Channel, and you'll find an entirely new class of wealth. The upwardly mobile gentry. These weren't nobles. They were middle-class landowners who suddenly found themselves controlling vast estates because everyone above them was dead. The Paston family started as modest Norfolk landowners. When neighboring estates lost heirs during plague waves, the Pastons bought land at massive discounts. Within generations, they were power brokers with access to courts and royal favor. The De la Pole family rose through trade and snapping up abandoned plague lands. They became dukes and kingmakers. The Nevilles expanded during plague-era vacancies in northern aristocracy. They'd later become central players in the Wars of the Roses. The Stanleys, future kingmakers at Bosworth Field. Their rise began with plague-era land consolidation. These families didn't storm castles. They just showed up when no one else could, and they bought property when prices collapsed. That's it. That's how you build a dynasty during a pandemic. Up north, in the frozen Baltic ports, a different kind of winner emerged, the Hanseatic League. This wasn't a country, it was a merchant network spanning from Lübeck to Riga to Bruges, and when the plague hit, they understood something crucial. Scarcity equals profit. Europe's grain harvest collapsed. Maritime trade suffered. Prices for essential goods skyrocketed. The Hanseatic merchants stepped in with cold precision. Families like the Weckenhusen of Danzig and the Gewerdis of Lübeck bought cheap grain from untouched eastern regions, sold it at enormous markups in plague-stricken western cities, secured monopolies on timber and salt, crucial rebuilding materials, turned commodity control into political power. While Europe burned, the Hanseatic League built shipping empires. They weren't evil, they were just very, very good at supply and demand. Then there were the institutions that couldn't die. Monasteries and church orders. When families died without heirs, guess who inherited? When nobles faced death and wanted salvation, guess who received their estates? The church. The Cistercians in France. The Benedictines in Germany. They absorbed land like a sponge. Vineyards, mills, livestock, entire villages. Not through conquest, through donations and inheritance law. Turns out, when people panic about the afterlife, they invest in what feels eternal. And in medieval Europe, that meant the church. These weren't just religious institutions. They were economic empires, collecting rents, producing goods, and shaping entire regional economies. The Black Death didn't weaken the church's power. It turbocharged it. Beyond the Medici, other Italian banking dynasties rose from plague economics. The Strozzi family rebuilt wealth by buying land at fire sale prices during demographic collapse. The Pazzi family expanded merchant banking when competitors died off. The old giants, the Bardi and Peruzzi, had collapsed under unpaid royal debts even before the plague. The pandemic finished them off, wiping out branches across Europe. Second-tier families got promoted by circumstance. In medieval banking, losing your heirs meant losing your bank. The survivors inherited everything. Here's the twist nobody expects. Ordinary people won, too. For the first time in centuries, workers had leverage. Labor scarcity meant wages skyrocketed. Serfs negotiated better terms or walked away from feudal obligations entirely. England passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351, trying to cap wages and prevent labor mobility. It failed. You can't legislate away supply and demand. What happened? Wages rose across Europe. Social mobility increased dramatically. Guilds opened doors to new members. Apprentices became masters years earlier than tradition allowed. This wasn't elite-level wealth, but it was a working-class boom. For a brief historical moment, ordinary people had bargaining power, something they'd rarely experienced before. It was a quiet revolution born from demographic collapse. Here's why this matters beyond medieval history. This pattern repeats in every major crisis. 2008 financial crisis. Distressed debt investors and private equity firms emerged stronger than ever. Small businesses died. Goldman Sachs thrived. COVID-19 pandemic. Billionaire wealth surged by trillions while small businesses closed permanently. Amazon, Zoom, Moderna, they didn't just survive, they dominated. The tools change, structured finance instead of inheritance law, online monopolies instead of grain cartels. But the mechanism is identical. Crises don't distribute wealth evenly. They concentrate it. They amplify existing advantages. They reward liquidity, connections, and adaptability. They create opportunities for those positioned to act while everyone else struggles to survive. The Black Death didn't just kill half of Europe, it reshuffled the deck of European wealth and power completely. What the plague created, the Renaissance, by empowering families like the Medici, England's political structure for centuries, through the rise of gentry families. The dominance of the Hanseatic League, the expanded economic power of the church, the modern banking landscape from Florence to Bruges. There's a quiet irony in this. The plague that seemed to end the world created the world that followed. Out of devastation came mobility, consolidation, and new elites. Out of loss came opportunity. Out of chaos came systems that still influence us today. The lesson isn't comforting, but it's clarifying. Disasters don't distribute wealth evenly. They create pockets of immense opportunity. Whether that opportunity becomes progress or exploitation depends entirely on who steps forward to claim it. The families I've told you about today aren't footnotes. They're the Medici who ruled Tuscany, the Visconti who ruled Milan, the Nevilles who shaped the Wars of the Roses, the Hanseatic merchants who influenced Northern Europe for centuries. But what's left out of their stories is the mechanism of their rise: death, scarcity, consolidation, and strategic opportunism unleashed by the Black Death. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And if you don't understand how wealth behaves in crisis, you'll never understand how power is really built. If this changed how you see history, hit subscribe. Because every week we follow the money that everyone else ignores. The answers are in the past. I'll show you where to look.